Ethan Walker had been back in Maple Ridge barely 20 minutes when he saw her. He was still hauling boxes out of the truck, stacking them on the uneven porch steps one by one. The late afternoon air carried the smell of dust and cut grass. In the passenger seat, his 5-year-old son Cameron drifted in and out of sleep, small hand curled around a worn stuffed bear. That's when Ethan noticed the woman standing across the street. She held a glass baking dish covered in foil, steam rising faintly into the cooling air. She wasn't rushing, wasn't hesitant either, just waiting, as if his return had been expected. When their eyes met, she crossed the road with steady, unhurried steps. Up close, she offered a simple introduction. "I'm Lena. I live right over there," she said, nodding toward the house opposite his. Then she placed the warm dish into his hands before he had a chance to refuse. "You don't have to do this alone." The words were plain, almost casual, but they landed somewhere deep inside him. Ethan didn't yet know her last name. He didn't know she had lived in that house for 6 years or that she worked as a therapist at the clinic on Pine Street. He would learn those details within minutes, standing awkwardly on his new porch, holding lasagna he hadn't asked for while Cameron pressed his face against the truck window to watch the stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. For now, all Ethan knew was this. In a town he had left years ago and returned to reluctantly, someone had stepped forward before he even unpacked a single box. And something in him, tight and guarded since the move began, loosened just slightly. When Ethan finally carried the boxes and the lasagna inside, the house greeted him with the stale scent of closed windows and old wood. The air felt heavy, undisturbed. Thin fractures ran along the plaster walls like faint scars, and somewhere in the kitchen, a faucet dripped with slow persistence, each drop echoing too loudly in the empty space. Cameron stood just inside the hallway, clutching his stuffed bear to his chest. He looked up at his father with complete confidence, the kind only a child can give. That look tightened something in Ethan's chest. This was the first place that was supposed to last. The past year had been a string of temporary arrangements, a cramped apartment near the base, then his ex-wife's mother's house while lawyers negotiated the details of a life coming apart. After that, 3 weeks in a roadside motel outside Albany while Ethan scraped together enough money to close on this house. Cameron was 5 years old, and this would be the first bedroom he could call entirely his own. Ethan had returned from 2 overseas deployments to find that home no longer recognized him. His wife, his former wife now, had told him plainly that the man who walked back through the door wasn't the one she had married. He couldn't argue. He had shed weight and sleep, and the habit of constantly measuring danger had followed him back. Even in quiet rooms, he caught himself tracking doorways and windows without meaning to. The divorce had been finalized 7 months earlier. By then, he had stopped trying to salvage anything except time with his son. The judge called the custody arrangement balanced, alternate weekends and shared holidays. Ethan nodded when the decision was read. It still felt like losing. Maple Ridge had once been the place he swore he would outgrow. Now it was the only town he could afford while living on a veteran's pension and searching for steady work. Coming back didn't feel like a victory. It felt like stepping backward. Still, as Cameron wandered down the narrow hallway, peeking into the room that would soon be painted sky blue, Ethan forced himself to believe that starting over here might mean something different. Not retreat. Maybe repair. The first week passed in a blur of work. Ethan focused on what he could fix. He tightened the loose porch railing, replaced the faucet that wouldn't stop dripping, and patched the thin cracks in the walls. When Cameron asked for his room to be the color of the sky, Ethan bought the palest blue he could find and spent an entire Saturday rolling paint across the small walls until the space felt lighter. Each evening, after his son had fallen asleep, Ethan sat on the front steps and looked out at the quiet street. Doubt crept in strongest at that hour. He wondered if returning to Maple Ridge had been a mistake, if choosing familiarity over opportunity had been cowardice disguised as responsibility. Across the road, Lena's kitchen light came on every night at nearly the same time, a warm square against the dark. Once she caught him looking and lifted her hand in a small wave. He returned it, nothing more. But Lena's kindness didn't end with that first meal. On the 3rd morning, she knocked on his door holding 2 cups of coffee. She mentioned, almost casually, that Ruth at the Saturday farmers market gave discounts to veterans. Ethan hadn't told her about his service. He realized quickly that in a town like this, information moved faster than introductions. Over the next 2 weeks, Lena eased him into the community without making it feel like assistance. She invited him to the diner on Main Street, where Doug insisted Cameron try the pancakes on the house. She mentioned that Pete at the hardware store sometimes needed part-time help. She pointed him toward the community board at the library where neighbors posted small repair jobs, fences, lawns, furniture assembly. Each suggestion was delivered plainly. No pity, no grand gestures, just facts. What unsettled Ethan wasn't the help itself. It was the way Lena regarded him while offering it. She didn't treat him like someone fragile. She didn't speak to him with careful sympathy. She looked at him like someone who understood what it meant to rebuild a life from the ground up. And that steadiness, quiet, unspoken, felt earned. Cameron surprised Ethan by how quickly he warmed to Lena. With most adults, the boy stayed half hidden behind his father's leg, offering only quiet nods when spoken to. But with Lena, something shifted. She never towered over him or rushed him. She knelt until they were eye level and asked questions about his stuffed bear as if conducting serious research. Its name, what it liked to eat, whether it snored at night. Cameron answered thoughtfully, and she listened as though every word mattered. The trust came naturally after that. One afternoon, Cameron sat at the kitchen table with a box of crayons and drew 3 stick figures standing in front of a bright blue house. When he finished, he held the paper up proudly. "That's Dad," he said, pointing to the tallest figure. "That's Lena. And that's me." Ethan studied the drawing long after Cameron had gone to bed. The simplicity of it unsettled him more than anything else. In his son's mind, the 3 of them already belonged in the same picture. As the weeks passed, Ethan and Lena slipped into an easy rhythm. On Saturday mornings, she helped him sand down the kitchen cabinets. On Sundays, he repaired the loose step on her back porch. They drove together to Cameron's kindergarten orientation, and when the boy ran toward them clutching a crayon drawing of a fire truck, he handed it out as if they were equally responsible for his pride. At the farmer's market the following weekend, Ruth gave them a long, knowing look. It wasn't judgment, more like recognition. Ethan felt the shift too, in small touches when they passed in narrow hallways, in shared glances over Cameron's laughter. In the half-second her eyes lingered on his before turning away. The feeling grew quietly, steadily, like a low current beneath every conversation. And it scared him. The deeper the connection grew, the more uneasy Ethan became. He recognized the sensation, hope threading itself through caution, and it frightened him. The last time he had allowed himself to trust this kind of closeness, it had ended in legal documents, empty rooms, and a 5-year-old asking why his father didn't live with him anymore. One evening, after Cameron was asleep, Lena sat beside him on the porch with a bottle of wine between them. The street was quiet, the air cool. She spoke gently but directly. She told him she could feel him stepping back, that every time their conversations brushed against something real, something vulnerable, he found a reason to stand, to check on Cameron, to change the subject. Ethan stared into the dark for a long time before answering. He admitted he didn't trust himself to do this right. His history with people who mattered most to him wasn't exactly reassuring. Cameron was the one thing in his life he couldn't afford to fail. Everything else, including whatever was forming between him and Lena, felt like a risk he might not be entitled to take. Lena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she placed her glass on the railing and looked at him steadily. She wasn't asking for guarantees, she said. She wasn't asking for perfection or promises about forever. She only wanted to know whether he was willing to try. Not bravely. Not flawlessly. Just honestly. The question settled heavily in his chest. He thought about the half-unpacked boxes still stacked inside the house. He thought about Cameron's drawing taped to the refrigerator. He thought about the way Lena locked her front door twice every night, as if she too understood what it meant to feel unsafe. Before doubt could gather its usual momentum, before he could retreat into familiar defenses, Ethan answered. Yes, saying it was simple. Learning how to live inside, that answer would be something else entirely. At first, nothing looked different. But inside the quiet spaces of his mind, Ethan slipped into old habits. He began scanning not for physical danger, but for emotional fallout. He caught himself watching for the moment Lena would see him clearly and decide he was too complicated. He imagined Cameron growing attached, only to be disappointed later. He felt the town's watchful curiosity like a spotlight he couldn't turn off. It started subtly. At the diner, Doug refilled his coffee and casually asked if Lena was the one helping him settle in. At the hardware store, Pete commented that Lena deserved someone steady. Even Ruth at the farmer's market tilted her head and observed that Ethan looked happier these days. No one said anything unkind, they didn't need to. The awareness of being observed tightened his shoulders. So he pulled back in ways he hoped would go unnoticed. He stopped suggesting weekday dinners. Conversations became lighter, safer. When Cameron asked if Lena would come to his first real day of kindergarten, Ethan answered maybe, knowing full well that meant no. At night, lying beneath the slow clicking of the ceiling fan, he argued with himself. One voice insisted he was protecting his son. Another suggested he was protecting his own fear and disguising it as responsibility. He remembered his ex-wife telling him he had a talent for being physically present while emotionally somewhere else. He had hated hearing it. He hated even more that it might be true. Lena noticed the change, of course she did. But instead of confronting him, she gave him exactly what he seemed to be asking for: space. 3 days passed without her knocking on his door. Cameron asked about her twice. Ethan said she was busy with work. It wasn't entirely false, but it felt incomplete. The silence pressed heavier than any argument could have. Then on a Friday evening, a message from Lena appeared on his phone. A friend of hers owned a cabin by a lake 40 minutes north. It was empty for the weekend. Cameron could come if Ethan wanted, or not. It was simply an invitation, not a test. Ethan read the message more than once before responding. Ethan stared at Lena's message for several minutes before doing anything. Instead of replying, he called his ex-wife and asked if she could take Cameron for the weekend. It wasn't part of their usual schedule, but she agreed without pressing for details. Saturday morning, he dropped his son off, drove home, and sat in his truck longer than necessary before finally texting Lena back. He told her he would drive. The cabin stood tucked behind a thin line of birch trees, set a short distance from the lake. It was modest, wood-paneled walls, an agging stove, windows that stuck when pushed open. They arrived in the late afternoon and spent the first hour doing small, practical things, carrying bags inside, airing out the rooms, figuring out how to light the pilot flame. The quiet between them felt charged, not uncomfortable exactly, but waiting. They ate simple sandwiches on the dock as the sun lowered over the water. The surface of the lake reflected gold and orange light, still except for the occasional ripple. Lena set her plate aside first. She looked at him in the same patient way she always did when she sensed something unspoken. Ethan exhaled and began. He admitted he had been pulling away. He knew she knew. He said the town's attention made him feel as if every step was being evaluated. He was afraid of failing again, afraid of building something that would collapse. In the military, the rules had been clear: follow orders, complete the mission, survive if you could. Civilian life felt less defined. There were no instructions for what good enough looked like. And whenever he came close to happiness, a part of him started counting down to when it would be taken away. Lena didn't interrupt. When he finished, she didn't analyze him or soften his words with professional language. Instead, she told him something she had never shared with anyone in Maple Ridge. Before moving to town, she had spent nearly 4 years in a relationship with a man who controlled her life piece by piece. He chose what she wore. He monitored her phone. He convinced her slowly that she was incapable of surviving without him. Leaving had meant driving 8 hours straight with a single bag in the back seat and starting over from nothing. She rebuilt everything: her career, her friendships, her sense of safety. She relearned how to sleep through the night without checking the locks repeatedly. And she said clearly that she hadn't done all that work just to become someone's temporary refuge. She wouldn't help a man heal only to watch him disappear once he felt steady again. Her honesty hit him with a clarity that strung. She wasn't threatening him, she was namming her boundary. She was asking him to decide, not with grand promises but with consistent presence. Not perfection. Not fearlessness. Just staying. Ethan looked out across the darkening lake before meeting her eyes again. He couldn't promise he wouldn't make mistakes, but he could promise he wouldn't vanish. When things became difficult, he would remain in the room. Lena held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, as if something important had been agreed upon without paperwork. When they drove back to Maple Ridge the next day, nothing about them appeared dramatically different. But something between them had steadied. When they came back from the cabin, nothing outwardly dramatic had changed. They weren't louder about their relationship, nor did they make any announcements. But there was a new steadiness between them, something quieter and more deliberate. Lena began spending more evenings at Ethan's house after Cameron went to bed. They cooked together in the narrow kitchen, bumping into each other as they moved around the stove. They disagreed over small things, how to arrange the cabinets, whether the porch needed replacing or just sanding, but the arguments felt ordinary. Healthy. Real. Cameron started asking for Lena at breakfast without hesitation, and for the first time, Ethan didn't tense at the sound of it. The house, once a symbol of retreat, began to feel like intention. But peace in Maple Ridge never stayed uncomplicated for long. The first ripple came one Tuesday evening. Ethan was helping Cameron with a puzzle when he heard a car door slam across the street. Through the window, he saw a black sedan parked in front of Lena's house. A tall man stood on her porch, hands in his pockets. Lena opened the doors. Even from a distance, Ethan noticed the shift in her posture. Her shoulders curved inward, she seemed smaller somehow. The man spoke. Lena shook her head. He kept talking. After a few minutes, she stepped back inside and closed the door. The man remained there briefly before returning to his car and driving away. Lena didn't mention it that night. Ethan didn't ask. But the next morning, he saw her through her kitchen window sitting at the table, phone in hand. She turned it face down, then picked it up again, staring at the screen before lowering it once more. He sent a simple message, "Are you okay?" Her reply came quickly. "Fine." Ethan knew that word well enough to understand it rarely meant what it said. 2 days later, a second disruption arrived. A hospital system in Albany called with a full-time maintenance position, steady hours, benefits, nearly double the income he was piecing together through part-time work and small jobs. They needed an answer within 10 days. Ethan sat on his back porch with the phone still in his hand, feeling the ground tilt beneath him. Albany was 3 hours away. Taking the job would mean uprooting Cameron from the first school he liked, leaving behind the house he had only begun to repair, and putting distance between himself and the woman who had taught him what it meant to stay. That evening he told Lena about the offer. He watched her carefully as he spoke. She didn't flinch, she didn't argue. Instead, she asked practical questions: salary, schedule, housing, long-term stability. When he finished explaining, she said something that made the decision heavier, not lighter. She would not be the reason he refused a better future for his son. And she would not be the reason he accepted a worse one. The choice had to be his, made for the right reasons. Whatever he decided, she would respect it. It was the most generous response he could have imagined. And it made everything far more complicated. Marcus came back that Saturday afternoon. Ethan was on his porch helping Cameron with a puzzle when the black sedan rolled up again. This time he watched everything. Marcus stepped out slowly, exuding the quiet confidence of someone who believed the house or its people still belonged to him. He didn't wait for an invitation. When Lena opened the door, he leaned in slightly, reaching for her hand with a touch that was almost gentle, almost affectionate. Ethan recognized the gesture immediately. It wasn't care. It was possession masquerading as tenderness. Lena pulled her hand away, firm but calm. Marcus continued to speak, filling the space around him, ignoring boundaries. Ethan's instincts, honed over 2 combat tour, kicked in automatically. He moved without thinking, halfway across the street in an instant, every muscle coiled to protect, intervene, neutralize the threat. And then Lena's voice echoed in his memory, from the cabin, reminding him she had rebuilt her life alone. She didn't need rescuing. Ethan froze. In that suspended moment he understood. If he acted on his anger now, if he tried to save her, he would be doing exactly what Marcus always had, diminishing her to make himself feel necessary. So he stopped. He remained visible at the edge of her yard, calm, deliberate, holding his ground without stepping forward. Marcus noticed him. The man's face split into a half-smile, half-challenge, a look meant to provoke a reaction. He muttered something Ethan couldn't hear, directed at Lena but intended for him. Then he smiled fully, daring Ethan to react. Ethan didn't move, he didn't speak. He simply stood there, a silent wall of presence, letting Lena handle what was hers to handle. Later that night, after Marcus finally left, Lena came across the street. Her hands trembled slightly, but her face was steady. Ethan reached for her hand and she allowed it. They stayed like that until her breathing evened out. "Thank you," she said softly. Not for saving her, for letting her save herself. Ethan understood, and he knew in a way he hadn't before what strength really looked like. 3 days later, the Albany job deadline arrived. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the offer letter spread before him and a cup of coffee growing cold beside it. On paper it was perfect: steady hours, benefits, a salary nearly double what he could earn locally. The responsible choice. The decision a good father would make for his son's future. But Ethan had lived long enough to know that numbers on paper didn't hold a life together. Albany meant uprooting Cameron from the school he had come to love, taking him away from his first bedroom that felt entirely his own, and leaving behind the streets, the house, the small life he'd begun building with Lena. It meant distance from the woman who had shown him that love, patience, and presence weren't grand gestures, they were daily choices. It meant running again, not from danger, but from the slow, steady work of creating something permanent. Ethan picked up the phone. He called the HR representative and declined the offer. "Yes, I'm sure," he said when asked. After hanging up, he waited for regret to settle in. It didn't. Instead came clarity. Something he hadn't felt in years, before the military, before the divorce, before all the mistakes and losses that had taught him to doubt himself. He knew what he wanted. He wanted this house, this street, this town. He wanted the sound of Cameron's crayons on the refrigerator, Lena's voice in the kitchen, and the screen door slamming on warm summer evenings. He wanted the small, ordinary life he could hold on to, and for the first time, wanting something small didn't feel like failure. By the following week, he applied for a maintenance position at the regional hospital just 20 minutes outside Maple Ridge. Less pay than Albany, yes, but better than odd jobs. Reliable hours, early mornings, home by mid-afternoon, weekends free. Within 5 days, he got a call back. When he told Lena, she didn't say she was proud. She didn't announce that he had made the right choice. She only said she was glad, simply, honestly. That was enough. Life moved forward quietly, as real life does, not in ceremonies or dramatic declarations, but in the accumulation of ordinary days that, in hindsight, felt extraordinary. Over the following weeks, Lena began leaving small things at Ethan's house: a toothbrush, a change of clothes, a few books on the living room shelf. Cameron stopped treating her visits as temporary. She became part of the rhythm of their lives. One morning, the boy came downstairs for breakfast and saw Lena making eggs at the stove. He sat at the table without a word, as if this had always been his daily routine. Watching him, Ethan felt something inside him unlock, a part of him he hadn't realized was still closed off. The house began to feel alive. They argued sometimes about money, parenting, or whether Ethan was overextending himself at the hospital. The disagreements weren't polite or quiet, but they were honest. Every argument ended the same way: at the kitchen table, talking until anger cooled and understanding replaced it. Lena had once told him that conflict wasn't the enemy of a relationship, avoidance was. Ethan had come to believe her because she lived it. By the time autumn settled over Maple Ridge, the house reflected the life they were building. Cracks in the plaster were patched, the porch boards replaced. Cameron's sky blue room had a new bookshelf heaped with books Lena brought from the library. The once dripping kitchen faucet no longer sounded in the silence. Instead, the house was filled with footsteps, clattering plates, and conversations for three. Cameron's relationship with his mother also stabilized. Ethan took care to make transitions smooth, packing his son's bag without resentment, speaking of his ex-wife without bitterness, and ensuring Cameron understood that having two homes didn't mean belonging to neither. It wasn't effortless. Some nights Cameron returned quiet, withdrawn. Ethan resisted the urge to interrogate or fix. Instead, he followed Lena's example. He sat with his son, gave him space to speak when ready, and showed up without demanding anything in return. In those ordinary, repeated moments, the house transformed. It became a home, not by chance but by choice. One Sunday morning in late October, Ethan drove to a nearby town and bought a ring. It was simple: a gold band with a small stone. The shopkeeper told him it had belonged to a couple married for 52 years. Ethan liked that. He liked the idea that the ring had already learned how to last. He didn't plan a proposal. There were no rehearsed words, no staged setting. It happened naturally on a Thursday evening. Lena was washing dishes. Cameron was drawing at the kitchen table. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching them, Lena with her sleeves rolled up, Cameron humming a tune from school, and felt the full weight of the ordinary, irreplaceable life that had quietly settled around him. He walked over, took Lena's wet hands in his own, and asked her to marry him. She looked at him, then at Cameron, then back at Ethan, and said yes. Not dramatically, not tearfully, just with her usual steadiness, the quiet certainty that had always defined her presence. They married the first Saturday in December. The air was cold enough to see your breath, but not so cold they had to move inside. Ruth from the farmer's market brought flowers. Doug from the diner brought a cake, claiming he baked it himself, though no one believed him. Pete from the hardware store stood in the back and clapped louder than anyone. Cameron, in a clip-on tie, held the rings on a small pillow, understanding in his 5-year-old way how important the moment was. Later that week, Lena moved in officially, carrying the last of her boxes across the street. The house Ethan had once seen as a refuge, settled out of necessity, was now something else entirely. Not perfect. The heating was unreliable. The hallway floorboards still creaked. The yard demanded work that might never be finished. But every corner carried evidence of the life they were building together. Cameron's drawings taped to the walls, Lena's books lining shelves, Ethan's tools in the garage beside small rain boots and a well-loved stuffed bear. Home, Ethan realized, wasn't a destination. It was something you built by choosing to stay, not once but every day, through the arguments, the doubts, and the quiet, ordinary mornings. For the first time in his life, Ethan Walker knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of their lives settled into something both ordinary and profound. Lena's presence became seamless. Her toothbrush found a place in the bathroom, a spare set of clothes hung in the closet, and books slowly filled the shelves Ethan had cleared for her. Cameron no longer treated her visits as temporary. She was part of their home. Breakfast became a quiet ritual. One morning, Cameron descended the stairs, saw Lena cooking, and sat down at the table without a word, as if this had always been the way life worked. Ethan watched him, feeling a quiet unlocking in his chest, a release he hadn't realized he was holding. Arguments arose, as they naturally do. Money, parenting, the right balance of work and home life, all of it sparked occasional tension. But these conflicts were honest. They ended not in silence or withdrawal, but at the kitchen table, where discussion and compromise replaced frustration. Lena had once told him that conflict isn't the enemy of a relationship, avoidance is. Ethan was beginning to understand this truth firsthand. By autumn, the house had transformed to reflect the life within. Cracks in the plaster were patched, the porch boards repaired, and Cameron's pale blue room now boasted a bookshelf filled with books Lena brought from the library. The kitchen faucet, once dripping quietly in the silence, now competed with the clatter of plates, the hum of conversation, and Cameron's footsteps. Ethan worked to smooth the relationship between his son and ex-wife, packing Cameron's bag without resentment and speaking without bitterness. He made sure Cameron knew that having two homes didn't mean belonging to neither. Nights still came when Cameron returned subdued, and Ethan learned to sit with him, offering patience and presence rather than solutions, just as Lena had shown by example. In these ordinary acts of showing up, building trust, and sharing life's small rhythms, Ethan realized that home wasn't a place you stumbled into. It was a life you actively created, day by day, with the people who mattered. And at last he felt firmly grounded, exactly where he belonged. One Sunday in late October, Ethan went to a nearby town and purchased a ring. It wasn't extravagant, a simple gold band with a modest stone, but the shopkeeper mentioned it had belonged to a couple married for 52 years. Ethan liked that. He liked the idea that the ring had already known how to last. He didn't plan a grand proposal. There were no rehearsed words or staged settings. It happened naturally on a Thursday evening. Lena was at the sink washing dishes, and Cameron was at the table, absorbed in a drawing. Ethan stood in the doorway, observing the scene, the way Lena moved, sleeves rolled up, the hum of Cameron's little song, and felt the profound weight of ordinary life surrounding him. He approached them, took Lena's wet hands in his own, and simply asked her to marry him. She looked at him, then at Cameron, then back again, and said yes. It wasn't dramatic. There were no tears, no speeches. Just the quiet certainty she carried in every gesture, the steady resolve that had quietly anchored their relationship. They married that first Saturday in December. The air was crisp, cold enough to see one's breath but still pleasant enough to stay outside. Friends from town joined in the celebration. Ruth from the farmer's market brought flowers, Doug from the diner delivered a cake he insisted he had baked himself, and Pete from the hardware store clapped louder than anyone else. Cameron, dressed in a clip-on tie, held the rings on a small pillow, understanding, at 5 years old, the weight of the moment. Later that week, Lena officially moved in, carrying the final boxes across the street. The house Ethan had once seen as a temporary retreat had transformed into a true home. It wasn't perfect. The heating was still unreliable, floorboards creaked in the hallway, and the yard required work that might never be finished. But each room reflected the life they were building together. Cameron's drawings taped to the walls, Lena's books lining the shelves, and Ethan's tools in the garage, now sharing space with small rain boots and a well-loved stuffed bear. Ethan realized something important. Home wasn't a destination. It was built day by day, through patience, care, effort, and showing up. And for the first time he knew he was exactly where he belonged. In the weeks that followed, life in the house settled into a rhythm that was quietly extraordinary. Lena left small traces of herself everywhere: a toothbrush in the bathroom, a change of clothes in the closet, books stacked on shelves Ethan had cleared. Cameron stopped thinking of her presence as temporary. She was simply part of their everyday life. Mornings grew calm and ordinary. One day Cameron came downstairs for breakfast, saw Lena at the stove and slid into his chair without a word. Watching him, Ethan felt a quiet shift inside, a sense of completeness he hadn't known he was missing. Disagreements arose, as they naturally do in a household. Money, parenting, how much extra work Ethan should take on. They argued, sometimes heatedly but always honestly. Every argument ended the same way: sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, talking until frustration gave way to understanding. Lena had once told him that conflict wasn't the enemy of a relationship, avoidance was. Ethan had come to believe her because she lived it. By the time autumn fully settled over Maple Ridge, the house reflected the life within. Cracks in the walls were repaired, the porch boards replaced, and Cameron's pale blue room now held a bookshelf stacked with books Lena brought from the library. The kitchen faucet, once dripping in quiet emptiness, now competed with the sound of footsteps, conversation, and clattering plates. Ethan also worked to maintain Cameron's relationship with his mother, packing his son's bag without resentment, speaking without bitterness, and helping him understand that having two homes didn't mean belonging to neither. There were still nights when Cameron returned quiet and withdrawn. Ethan had to resist the urge to fix things. Instead, he followed Lena's example. He sat with his son, letting him speak when ready, showing up consistently without demanding anything in return. Through these small, repeated acts, showing up, listening, building trust, Ethan realized the truth he had been learning all along. Home wasn't a place you arrived at. It was a life you created through daily effort, honesty, and care. And for the first time he felt fully at home, firmly planted in a life he had helped build. 3 days later, the deadline for the Albany job arrived. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, the offer letter spread out in front of him and a cooling cup of coffee at his side. On paper, the job was perfect: steady hours, benefits, a salary nearly twice what he was earning locally. The responsible choice. The choice any good father would make to secure his child's future. But Ethan had learned the hard way that numbers on paper couldn't hold a life together. Albany meant uprooting Cameron from his first school, from the first bedroom he had ever truly claimed as his own. It meant leaving behind the house he had begun repairing, the neighborhood he had started to know, and the woman who had quietly shown him that showing up every day, steadily, honestly, was what made life real. It meant running again, not from danger this time, but from the slow, unglamorous work of creating something permanent. Ethan took a deep breath and made the call. He declined the offer. "Yes, I'm sure," he said when the HR representative questioned him. He expected regret to follow, but it didn't. Instead came clarity, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a certainty about what he wanted. He wanted this house, this street, this town. He wanted Cameron's drawings on the fridge, Lena's voice in the kitchen, and the small, ordinary sounds of summer evenings, the screen door slamming, footsteps on the porch. He wanted the life they were building, and for the first time, wanting something small didn't feel like failure. The next week, Ethan applied for a maintenance position at the regional hospital, just 20 minutes outside Maple Ridge. The pay was less than Albany, but better than juggling odd jobs. The hours were steady: early mornings, home by mid-afternoon, and weekends free. Within 5 days, he received a call back. When he told Lena, she didn't praise him or claim he had made the right choice. She simply said she was glad, simply, honestly. That was enough. Life moved forward quietly. No grand announcements, no dramatic turning points, just the accumulation of ordinary days, small routines, and consistent effort that, over time, felt extraordinary in hindsight. Lena's presence became woven into the fabric of the house. A toothbrush here, a spare change of clothes there, books appearing on shelves. Cameron stopped treating her visits as temporary, she became part of their everyday life. Through these small acts, Ethan realized that home wasn't a place you arrived at. It was built day by day, through the effort, honesty, and care invested in the people who mattered most. The life they were creating together wasn't flashy or perfect, but it was theirs. And for the first time, Ethan felt grounded, present, and exactly where he belonged. As the weeks passed, the house gradually transformed into a true home. Lena's presence became seamless, her toothbrush and clothes found their spots, books stacked themselves on shelves Ethan had cleared, and Cameron stopped treating her visits as temporary. She was simply part of their life. Mornings settled into a quiet rhythm. One day, Cameron came downstairs, saw Lena cooking, and slid into his chair without a word. Watching him, Ethan felt a long-closed part of himself finally open. The ordinary moments, the smell of breakfast, the sound of their laughter, the hum of everyday life, began to feel profound. Arguments arose, as they always do in a household. Money, parenting choices, the balance of Ethan's work, tensions flared occasionally. But every disagreement ended the same way, at the kitchen table, talking until understanding replaced frustration. Lena had once told him that conflict wasn't the enemy of a relationship. Avoidance was. Ethan was learning to live that truth. By autumn, the house itself reflected the life within. Cracks in the plaster were repaired, the porch boards replaced, and Cameron's pale blue room now held a bookshelf brimming with books Lena brought from the library. The kitchen faucet, once dripping in quiet emptiness, now competed with the sounds of plates, footsteps, and conversation. Ethan also worked to keep Cameron's relationship with his mother steady, packing his son's bag without resentment and speaking of his ex-wife without bitterness. Some nights, Cameron returned subdued, but Ethan learned to sit with him, letting him speak when ready and offering presence rather than solutions. Through these small, repeated acts, the house became a home. One Sunday in late October, Ethan went to a nearby town and purchased a ring. It was simple, a gold band with a small stone, but the shopkeeper mentioned it had belonged to a couple married for 52 years. Ethan liked the idea that the ring had already known how to last. He didn't plan a proposal. There were no rehearsed words, no staged setting. It happened naturally on a Thursday evening. Lena was washing dishes, Cameron drawing at the table. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching them, feeling the ordinary life around him, the small, irreplaceable moments of home. He approached Lena, took her wet hands in his, and asked her to marry him. She looked at him, then at Cameron, then back at Ethan, and said yes. Not dramatically, not tearfully. Just with her quiet, steady certainty, the same calm resolve that had always defined her presence. They married the first Saturday in December. The air was cold enough to see one's breath, but not so cold they had to go indoors. Friends and neighbors attended. Ruth from the farmer's market brought flowers, Doug from the diner a cake he swore he baked himself, and Pete from the hardware store clapped louder than anyone. Cameron, in a clip-on tie, held the rings on a pillow, understanding in his 5-year-old way the importance of the moment. Later that week, Lena officially moved in, carrying the last of her boxes across the street. The house that had once felt like a refuge, a temporary retreat, became something else entirely. It wasn't perfect. The heating was unreliable, floorboards creaked, the yard still needed work, but every corner held evidence of the life they were creating together. Cameron's drawings adorned the walls, Lena's books filled the shelves, and Ethan's tools shared the garage with rain boots and a well-loved stuffed bear. Ethan realized home wasn't a place you arrived at. It was something you built day, by showing up, by arguing and compromising, by caring for each other in ordinary moments. For the first time, Ethan Walker understood what it meant to belong somewhere, not just to a house but to a life. He was exactly where he was supposed to be.